The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl clinging to a broken bridge rail, and his next move split the river's rage. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin the story. The rain came down in sheets, like the sky itself was weeping. The thunder rumbled, shaking the air, as Jake Reaper Morrison sped down the highway, his Harley-Davidson roaring beneath him. The familiar hum of the engine was the only sound in the deafening storm. He was used to the rain, the cold, the miles of empty road stretching out ahead. But tonight, something was different. His eyes were trained on the road, his hands steady on the handlebars, but deep down, he felt an unsettling presence. It wasn't the storm. It wasn't the long stretch of road. It was something else, something he couldn't quite place. As he approached the old, rusted bridge, he saw her. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7, clinging to the broken rail of the bridge, her tiny fingers slipping on the metal. Her clothes were soaked through, her face pale and tear-streaked. She was trembling, barely holding on as the wind howled around her. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He was a biker, a Hell's Angel, and he had seen his fair share of trouble. But this was different. This wasn't just another mess he could ride away from. He slammed his fist onto the brake, his tires screeching as the bike slid to a halt. The girl's eyes met his for a split second, and she screamed, the sound lost in the howling wind. Jake's instincts kicked in. He jumped off the bike and rushed toward her. "Hey, hold on," he shouted, his voice cutting through the storm. She was terrified, her eyes wide with fear as she clung tighter to the rail. She thought he was another threat, another danger. Jake stopped in his tracks. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice softer now, more reassuring. The little girl didn't move, her body trembling like a leaf in the wind. Jake took a step closer, trying to make himself as non-threatening as possible. He knew the look in her eyes, the fear of the unknown, the fear of something bigger and scarier. "It's okay," he said, taking another step. "I'm here to help." The rain poured down harder, but Jake barely noticed. His focus was on the girl, who still held on to the rail with all her might. She was small, fragile, and the bridge was swaying under the pressure of the storm. One wrong move, and she could be gone in an instant. Jake didn't hesitate. He reached out, his gloved hand carefully gripping her arm, trying to steady her. "I've got you," he said firmly, gently pulling her away from the edge. She flinched at first, her body stiffening, but then she looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. He didn't know what drove him to stop. He didn't know why he couldn't just ride away like he usually would. But something about her, something about the way she was clinging to the broken bridge, made him realize that he couldn't leave her there. This wasn't a fight he could avoid. Jake wrapped his arm around the girl, pulling her close as he carefully guided her off the bridge. The wind howled, but they were both safe for now. "You're safe now," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was telling her or himself. The storm wasn't over. It never really was, but in that moment, as he held the little girl close, the storm inside him seemed to calm. The wind howled around them, the storm still relentless, but Jake held the little girl tightly, his leather-clad body a shield against the cold, biting rain. Her small, trembling frame pressed against him as they stumbled through the wet, uneven ground. He could feel her shivering, and as he glanced down at her, he noticed her wide, tear-filled eyes staring up at him. She looked terrified, lost, and confused. Her tiny fingers were curled tightly around his sleeve, as if she didn't know what to do or where to go. Jake's heart tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had seen far worse in his life, but this was different. This little girl wasn't just another stranger. She was someone who needed him, and for once, he couldn't just walk away. "We need to get somewhere safe," Jake said, his voice low and steady, despite the storm that seemed to roar louder by the second. The little girl nodded, though she still didn't speak. She was too afraid, too lost. Jake couldn't blame her. In the chaos of the storm, she must have felt like the world was falling apart around her. He had been in dark places before, places where the storm felt like it would never end, but he had always had a way out. She didn't. At least not yet. Jake led her toward the old, abandoned shack he had passed earlier on the road, a place that was long forgotten by time and nature. The door creaked in protest as he shoved it open with one hand, his other arm still around the girl, guiding her inside. The shack smelled musty, with the scent of mold and old wood hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. They were out of the rain, out of the storm, and that was all that mattered. Jake sat the girl down on an old, worn-out chair near the corner of the room, his eyes scanning the space. There was a small, cracked window, but it was better than nothing. He knelt down in front of her, trying to catch her gaze. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. The girl didn't answer at first. She just stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly with every breath, like she was still trying to process what had just happened. "It's okay," Jake said softly, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're safe now." She looked up at him, her eyes still filled with fear. "Where's my mom?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake froze. He hadn't thought about that. He had been so focused on getting her out of danger, he hadn't even asked where she had come from. He ran a hand through his wet hair, his mind racing. "I don't know, sweetheart," Jake said softly, kneeling down beside her. "But we'll figure it out. We'll find her." The girl's lips trembled, and Jake felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had always prided himself on being a lone wolf, but in that moment, he realized just how much he hated being alone. He wasn't just saving this little girl, he was saving himself, too. The storm outside raged on, but inside the shack, it was quiet, just the sound of the girl's soft sniffles and the occasional crackle from the storm. Jake didn't know how long they would stay there, or what would happen next, but one thing was clear. He wasn't leaving her. Not now. Not ever. And as he sat there, watching her slowly start to calm down, a new sense of purpose washed over him. He was no longer just a biker. He was a protector. The girl needed him, and he wouldn't let her down. The night had fallen deeper into the storm, and the shack, though small and rickety, felt like a fortress against the fury outside. Jake kept his eyes on the little girl, her trembling slowly subsiding, though the fear still clung to her. He had found a few old blankets in the corner of the shack and wrapped her up in one, the warmth offering some comfort. Her hair, soaked and sticking to her forehead, was a mess, and her clothes were still wet from the rain. Despite the shelter, Jake knew they weren't out of danger yet. The storm was relentless, and he had no idea how long they would be stuck here. "How long until my mom comes?" the girl asked, her voice still small and filled with doubt. Jake hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't know how to answer. He couldn't promise her anything he wasn't sure of. "We'll find her, okay?" he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We'll get you home, I promise." The little girl nodded, though her eyes were still full of confusion. Jake could see the wheels turning in her mind, the way her fear had started to turn into something deeper. The storm outside roared louder, and Jake knew they needed to think ahead. The shack wouldn't hold up for long in this kind of weather. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew they needed to leave soon. He stood up, his boots crunching against the floor as he moved to the window, peering out into the blackness. The rain lashed against the glass, the wind howling like a freight train. There was no sign of the storm letting up. The little girl watched him, her gaze following his every movement. "I'll be right back," Jake said, turning back to her. "I need to check the situation outside." He stepped out of the shack, his heavy leather jacket soaked through as soon as he stepped into the downpour. The cold bit into him, but he didn't care. The world outside was a blur of rain and wind, and Jake had to steady himself against the gusts that threatened to knock him off his feet. He looked around, trying to find any sign of hope in the midst of the storm. There was nothing, just the fury of nature bearing down on him. But Jake wasn't about to give up. He was a Hell's Angel. He had survived much worse than this. His mind raced with ideas, plans, but none of them felt right. He couldn't leave the girl alone. Not here. Not now. He glanced back at the shack, seeing the dim light through the window. She was still there. She was waiting for him. That was all the motivation he needed. He made a quick decision, stepping back inside. "We need to move," Jake said, his voice hard with resolve. The little girl looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's heart broke at her question, but he knew there was no choice. "I know a place," he said, pulling on his jacket. "It's safe." We'll get there, I swear. He grabbed the girl's hand, gently helping her to her feet. The storm was relentless, but they couldn't stay here any longer. They had to leave. Jake led her out of the shack, the wind whipping through his hair as they walked into the storm. The rain drenched them within seconds, but Jake didn't stop. He kept walking, one foot in front of the other, guiding the girl through the chaos. She stumbled a few times, but Jake was there, his strong hand steadying her each time. The road ahead was treacherous, but it didn't matter. He was determined to get her to safety, no matter what. The little girl walked silently beside him, her small body barely able to keep up with his long strides. But she didn't complain. She trusted him, and that was all that mattered. As they walked, Jake's mind kept flashing. Back to that moment on the bridge. The way she had clung to the broken rail, the terror in her eyes. He had seen that kind of fear before. It was the kind of fear that never truly went away. But Jake wasn't going to let that happen to her. Not if he could help it. As they trudged on, the storm showing no signs of letting up, Jake felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over him. He wasn't just a biker anymore. He was a protector, and nothing was going to stop him from keeping this little girl safe. The rain had started to lessen, but the wind was still relentless, biting through their clothes as Jake and the little girl trudged along the road. The storm was far from over, but it had eased just enough for Jake to push forward. His heart was still pounding from the earlier rush of fear. Fear for the little girl and the unknown dangers that lay ahead. She walked beside him, her small steps trying to match his pace. Every now and then, she stumbled, but Jake was right there, his hand gently steadying her. He didn't mind the cold. The only thing that mattered now was keeping her safe. The road was slick with rain, and the trees above them whipped in the wind, their branches creaking in protest. Jake's eyes scanned the surroundings, always alert, always aware of the danger. They had been walking for what felt like hours, but the place he had in mind was still a ways off. He had a cabin in the woods, a small, secluded place where no one would find them. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. The little girl had said nothing for a while. She hadn't cried, though her eyes still held that same fearful look from when he had first found her. She was exhausted, but she didn't complain. She was strong, stronger than most adults he knew. And in that moment, Jake realized something. He wasn't just protecting her. She was saving him too. He had never been a man for attachments. His life had always been about the road, the club, and the chaos that came with it. But now, with this little girl beside him, he felt something he hadn't in years: hope. Hope for something more than just survival. Hope for redemption. The wind howled, but Jake didn't flinch. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he also felt something else: purpose. They reached a small clearing ahead, and Jake paused, taking a deep breath. There, in the distance, was the cabin. It was nothing grand, just a small, weathered structure that had been passed down through his family, a place of solitude, a place to escape. He led the girl forward, his steps quicker now, the thought of shelter ahead pushing him onward. They finally reached the door, and Jake swung it open with a creak. The inside of the cabin was dark, but it was warm. A small fire crackled in the corner, the dim light casting long shadows against the walls. Jake moved to the hearth, gathering a few logs and adding them to the fire. The heat was immediate, and he could feel the warmth slowly creeping into his bones. He turned to the girl, who had wandered into the center of the room, her eyes wide as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. She seemed uncertain, but she didn't move. "It's okay," Jake said softly, his voice low and reassuring. "You're safe here." He walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. "I'll get you something warm. You've been through a lot." The little girl nodded, her small face still full of uncertainty. She hadn't spoken much since he found her, but Jake knew that would change in time. He grabbed an old blanket from the corner, spreading it out on the floor by the fire. "You can rest here," he said, motioning to the spot. "Get warm. We'll figure out what to do next." She hesitated for a moment before sitting down, wrapping herself in the blanket. Jake sat beside her, watching the flames dance. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had no answers for her, no way to fix the fear and confusion she must have been feeling. He wished he could tell her everything would be okay, but he couldn't. He wasn't sure himself. The wind outside howled, but the fire inside the cabin was steady. Jake sat there, his mind racing, trying to figure out their next move. He couldn't leave her. Not after everything she had been through. And whatever happened next, he would be there to protect her. He had no idea what the future held, but in that moment, he made a promise to himself. He would not fail her. They were in this together now. And no matter what, he wasn't going anywhere. The fire crackled in the corner, its warmth spreading slowly through the cabin, and Jake couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm despite the storm that still raged outside. The little girl, wrapped in the blanket, sat in front of the fire, her eyes flickering with the dancing flames. She hadn't said much since they had arrived, but Jake could see the weariness in her eyes, the exhaustion from the ordeal she had endured. He stood up, stretching his sore muscles, and moved to the small, battered kitchen area. His thoughts raced. He still had no idea where her mother was, or what had happened to her. All he knew was that he couldn't leave this girl alone. He couldn't just walk away from the one person who had, without realizing it, pulled him from the abyss. As he rummaged through the cabinets, pulling out whatever food he could find, the little girl's soft voice broke through the silence. "Are we going to find my mom?" she asked, her voice small but filled with quiet desperation. Jake froze for a moment. He didn't know the answer to that. He didn't have the slightest clue where to start. But he couldn't tell her that. Not when she was looking up at him with those big, trusting eyes. "We'll find her," Jake said, his voice steady, even though doubt gnawed at him. "I promise. We'll figure it out." The little girl nodded, but Jake could see the uncertainty in her gaze. She was scared, and rightfully so. She had no idea where she was, who to trust, or what would happen next. Jake set the small bowl of soup he had heated in front of her, and she took it without question, her hands still shaking slightly. He could see the hunger in her, and the need for something comforting after the chaos of the day. He sat down beside her, his back against the wall, watching her eat in silence. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind howling like a living thing. But inside the cabin, there was only the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of the girl's spoon against the bowl. "I'm really scared," she whispered, breaking the silence again. "I know," Jake said softly, his voice calm but with an edge of sorrow. "I know you are. But you're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you." She glanced up at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. Jake met her gaze, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You're not alone. I'm here." She nodded, but Jake could tell she was still worried, still thinking about her mother. He couldn't blame her. He couldn't even imagine the kind of fear she was feeling. But he knew one thing. He would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The night stretched on, the storm showing no signs of stopping. But inside the cabin, the fire slowly began to burn down to embers. Jake watched it for a moment before standing up. "We should get some sleep," he said, his voice low. "We'll need our strength tomorrow." The little girl nodded again, her head tilting slightly as she watched him. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jake moved to the small cot he had set up in the corner, a faded, threadbare mattress that had seen better days. He grabbed an extra blanket, laying it down beside the fire for her. "You can sleep here," he said, motioning to the spot. She hesitated for a moment before crawling over to the blanket and curling up. Jake stood by the fire for a few moments, watching the girl settle in. He felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over him, one he had never felt before. This little girl, this stranger who had found her way into his life, had become his reason to keep going. As he turned to lay down on the cot, his mind couldn't stop racing. How would they find her mother? Where would they go from here? He didn't know, but one thing was clear. He wasn't giving up. Not on her. The night was long, but eventually, Jake's exhaustion caught up with him. He closed his eyes, the sounds of the storm outside the only thing he could hear. But even as he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but whatever came their way, he would face it. For her. The morning came slowly, with the storm still raging in the distance. Jake woke up to the sound of the wind rattling the small cabin, the remnants of the night's rain tapping gently against the roof. He could feel the weight of the promise he had made to the little girl, a promise that felt heavier with every passing hour. As he sat up and rubbed his eyes, he looked over at her. She was still asleep, curled tightly in the blanket he had given her. Her small form rose and fell with each breath, and Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of protectiveness. He had never known the burden of caring for someone so young, so vulnerable. But now, it was his responsibility. Jake quietly got up, moving as silently as possible to avoid waking her. He needed to think, needed to come up with a plan. Her mother was out there somewhere, and Jake didn't know where to start looking. His mind raced as he checked his gear, making sure his motorcycle was still in working order. It had been a long night, and he wasn't sure how long they could stay here. The cabin was a safe haven for now, but he couldn't keep her hidden forever. He had to take action. The wind outside howled, but the storm was starting to lose its intensity. He walked over to the small window and peered outside, seeing the remnants of the rain puddling in the grass and mud. The world looked peaceful, almost too peaceful, after everything that had happened. Jake turned back to the girl, who was still asleep. She had been through so much in the past 24 hours, and he couldn't imagine what was going through her mind. She had lost her mother, had been left alone in the middle of a storm, and then found herself with a stranger. Jake clenched his fists, frustration rising in his chest. He couldn't fail her. Not now, not ever. He had to find her mother. He had no idea where to start, but he had to try. As he started to prepare for the journey ahead, the little girl stirred in her sleep, her soft, hesitant voice breaking the silence. "Where are we going?" she asked, her eyes still closed, but her voice filled with uncertainty. Jake froze, his heart aching at the question. He hadn't expected her to wake up so soon, but he wasn't ready to tell her the truth yet. He didn't have an answer, not a real one. "We're going to find your mom," he said softly, crouching beside her. She opened her eyes and looked up at him, her small face full of hope and fear all at once. "Are we really?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake took a deep breath, forcing a calm expression. "I promise you we will." The little girl nodded slowly, the weight of her emotions clear in her eyes. Jake knew he had to keep it together, for her. If he showed weakness, she would see it, and that wasn't an option. He had to be strong, not just for himself, but for her. "Let's get you something to eat," he said, his voice gentle. He walked over to the small stove in the corner, rummaging through the meager supplies he had. As he prepared a quick meal, the girl sat up, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her eyes never left him, and Jake couldn't help but feel the gravity of the situation. He had a lot to figure out, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Not as long as he was breathing. After a simple breakfast, Jake packed up his things, making sure they were ready for whatever the day might bring. The girl stood beside him, still unsure, but trusting him completely. They had no idea what lay ahead, no idea where they were going, but they had each other, and that was enough for now. Jake stood at the door of the cabin, taking one last look around. The wind was picking up again, but the storm had passed. He opened the door and stepped outside, the girl following closely behind him. The world was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He would keep moving forward, and he would keep the little girl safe. With every step they took, the promise he made to her became more real. The road ahead was uncertain, but with every mile, he would be her protector, and nothing would change that. The day broke cold and quiet, the storm having passed, but the lingering clouds hung low in the sky. Jake tightened his grip on the handlebars, his eyes scanning the road ahead as he and the little girl traveled down the lonely highway. The journey had been slow, but they had made progress. His mind was still full of questions about where her mother might be, where they were headed next, and how much longer they would have to keep running. The road stretched out before them, empty except for the occasional tree and the distant mountains looming in the background. The air was crisp, and Jake couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled in his chest. They hadn't seen another soul since they left the cabin, but that was fine. Jake didn't trust anyone, not when it came to her. The girl was still clinging to him, still silently following his every move, trusting him even when he had no idea what he was doing. He had become her protector, and despite the weight of the responsibility, Jake knew he couldn't let her down. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice soft, but laced with that same uncertainty she'd carried since the beginning. Jake glanced down at her, trying to offer some comfort. "Not far now," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was telling the truth. The map he had was vague at best. He wasn't sure where the nearest town was, or what would happen when they got there. But he had to keep moving. "We'll find your mom. I won't stop until we do," he promised, his voice firm. She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide, searching for any sign of reassurance. Jake didn't give her false hope, but he couldn't let her feel abandoned. He would do whatever it took to keep that promise. The bike roared on, the sound of the engine filling the otherwise quiet world. The rhythmic hum of the road beneath them had a way of calming Jake's restless thoughts, though it didn't do much for the unease building in his chest. There were so many unknowns ahead, dangerous roads, unfamiliar faces, and the threat of what might happen if they ran out of time. He glanced over at the little girl, who was clutching her jacket tight against her body, the wind still biting at her skin. Her face was drawn, but she didn't complain. She was a fighter, even at her age, and Jake admired her for it. It wasn't long before they saw the first sign of life on the horizon, a small gas station in the distance. It was run down, the lights barely flickering as they approached, but it was a place to stop, to refuel, and to maybe figure out their next move. Jake slowed the bike as they pulled up, his eyes scanning the area carefully. He didn't trust places like this, places where strangers lingered and questions were often asked. But they had no choice. They needed fuel, and more importantly, they needed information. As they parked, Jake kept a careful watch over the girl. He motioned for her to stay close as they walked toward the small, cracked door of the gas station. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and grease, the overhead lights buzzing intermittently. The man behind the counter looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing as he took in Jake's appearance, the leather jacket, the tattoos, the unmistakable presence of a biker who was used to being feared. The man hesitated for a moment, sizing them up, before his expression softened slightly. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. Jake glanced at the little girl, who was standing close to his side, clutching her jacket tight around her. She looked up at the man, but said nothing. "Just need some fuel," Jake said, his tone low. "And maybe some directions." The man nodded, his eyes lingering on the girl for a moment before turning to grab the fuel pump. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of curiosity. Jake hesitated for a moment, not sure how much to reveal. "Just passing through," he said, giving nothing away. The man nodded again, seeming satisfied with the answer, and began filling the tank. Jake took the opportunity to glance around the station, noting the old map pinned to the wall, the faded signs advertising snacks and drinks. It wasn't much, but it was enough for him to get his bearings. As the tank filled, Jake felt the weight of the moment settling in. He knew that they couldn't stay here for long. There was always the risk that someone would recognize them or ask too many questions. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to themselves. But for now this was a brief respite. He turned back to the man, handing him the payment, and offered a quick nod. "Thanks," Jake said, turning to leave. But before they could walk out the door, the man called out to him. "You folks lost or something?" he asked, his tone more pointed now. Jake froze, his heart skipping a beat. He glanced at the little girl, who looked up at him with wide eyes. He didn't know what to say. They couldn't afford to draw attention. But before he could respond, the man's gaze softened, and he gave a slight shrug. "Never mind," he said, his tone changing again. "You'll figure it out." With that, Jake turned and stepped outside, the little girl following closely behind him. They climbed back onto the bike, the sound of the engine filling the air as Jake revved it and sped off down the road. As the gas station disappeared behind them, Jake's mind raced. They were getting closer, but how much closer? And what would happen when they finally found her mother? The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a muted orange glow across the endless stretch of highway. The road seemed to go on forever, and the silence that hung between Jake and the little girl felt heavy, almost suffocating. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, the rumble of the engine the only sound between them. It had been days since they had left the small cabin, and the weight of the promise to find her mother still hung heavily on his mind. Every mile they traveled, every turn they made, only deepened the uncertainty of their journey. His mind kept racing with all the things that could go wrong. But he had made a promise, and he was determined to keep it. The little girl had barely spoken since the gas station. She was quieter now, perhaps adjusting to the strange reality of their situation. She was no longer asking about her mom, but Jake could see it in her eyes, the fear, the uncertainty, the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, she would see her mother again. He glanced over at her, noticing how her small hands clutched the back of his jacket. She was still trying to find comfort in the little things. The weight of that trust in him, the vulnerability she had given him, struck him hard. Jake wasn't used to being anyone's protector. He had always been a lone wolf, focused on the road, on surviving. But this little girl had changed everything. She had somehow cracked the walls he had built up over the years, and now he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: responsibility. As they rolled through the desolate stretches of road, Jake spotted a small diner on the side of the highway. It was nothing fancy, just a small, dimly lit building with a flickering neon sign. The sight of it was a welcome distraction. He hadn't eaten properly in days, and he knew the girl needed something more than the cold snacks they had been surviving on. He pulled the bike over and parked in front of the diner, taking a deep breath. The girl didn't say anything but slowly slid off the bike, following his lead. As they entered the diner, the warmth hit them immediately, and the smell of fried food and coffee filled the air. A few patrons sat scattered across the small tables, mostly truckers and travelers like Jake, all lost in their own thoughts. The waitress behind the counter looked up as they walked in, her eyes briefly scanning Jake's worn leather jacket and the girl at his side. She didn't seem to care much, though. She had probably seen worse in a place like this. "What can I get ya?" she asked, her voice dry but not unfriendly. Jake glanced at the little girl, who had already climbed into one of the booths, looking up at him with those wide, innocent eyes. "2 coffees and whatever you've got for breakfast," he replied, trying to sound casual. The waitress nodded and turned to pour the coffee, while Jake slid into the booth across from the girl. She was looking at the menu on the table, her small fingers tracing the edges of the laminated paper. "You hungry?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded quietly, not meeting his gaze. Jake leaned back in his seat, his mind drifting for a moment. He didn't know what the next step was. They had no plan, no destination. They were just 2 lost souls, hoping that the next sign would lead them somewhere. He couldn't even promise her that her mother would be waiting for them, though he wanted to. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay. But he couldn't. Not yet. "We'll figure it out," he muttered to himself. The waitress returned with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. She set them down in front of Jake, and then slid the plate of food in front of the little girl. She glanced at Jake, her eyes filled with quiet thanks. He nodded, but his gaze remained focused on the window, watching the world outside. The girl picked up her fork slowly, as if she wasn't sure whether to eat or wait for something. "You can eat," Jake said softly, turning his gaze back to her. "I'll be right here." She smiled faintly, the smallest flicker of reassurance, and then dug in, her small hands gripping the fork tightly. Jake watched her for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through sitting heavy in his chest. He had promised her mother he would take care of her, and he wasn't about to break that promise. Not now, not ever. As the girl ate, Jake leaned back in the booth, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. The storm had passed, but in many ways, the worst was still ahead. He had no idea what kind of trouble they might run into, or how much longer the road would stretch out before them. But one thing was certain: he would not stop. Not until he found her mother, and not until he knew she was safe. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the road as Jake and the little girl continued their journey. The weight of the promise Jake had made to her hung heavily in his mind. Every mile they traveled felt like a step closer to finding her mother, but with each passing moment, doubt crept in. The road was long, and the world around them felt vast and empty. He had no clear plan, no real destination. They were just 2 travelers in search of something they weren't sure existed. As they rolled through the quiet countryside, Jake's thoughts wandered to the girl beside him. She had been so quiet since their stop at the diner. Her small hands, which had once clutched at his jacket in fear, were now resting on her lap, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. She hadn't asked about her mom again, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. She was trying to stay strong, but he knew better. He knew the weight of the unknown was pressing on her, just as it was on him. The road ahead seemed endless, but Jake couldn't stop now. He had to keep going. He had to keep pushing forward. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't fail her. "We'll find her," Jake muttered to himself, though he wasn't sure if the words were meant for her or for him. The little girl looked up at him, hearing his words. She gave him a small, hesitant smile, but it was clear she didn't believe him. Jake could see it in the way she looked at him. There was a quiet sadness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. He was all she had now. He was her protector, but even he didn't know how to fix this. How to fix what had been broken. How to bring her mother back. The road stretched on, and the miles began to blur together. The occasional sign flashed by, telling him they were heading into a small town, but Jake didn't stop. He couldn't afford to draw attention to themselves, not yet. Not when he didn't know what he was walking into. His mind kept going back to the diner, the man behind the counter, his questions about where they were going. It wasn't much, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had been careful, keeping a low profile, but that kind of attention was never good. He had seen it before. People who were too curious for their own good. And Jake couldn't let them get in their way. The little girl shifted beside him, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "Where are we going, Jake?" she asked, her voice small, unsure. Jake glanced over at her, his heart heavy. She had stopped calling him Mr. a long time ago. She was beginning to trust him, and that trust weighed on him. "We're going to find your mom," Jake said, his voice steady, though inside, he was fighting a wave of doubt. "We'll figure it out, okay?" She nodded, though her eyes were filled with uncertainty. He could see the questions swirling in her mind, the same ones that haunted him. Where was her mother? Was she okay? Would they find her before it was too late? Jake didn't have the answers, but he couldn't show her that. He couldn't let her see his fear. Not now. Not when she was looking to him for protection. The landscape around them was changing as they continued down the road. The trees had thinned, and the open fields gave way to more clustered buildings. Jake's eyes stayed ahead, watching for any sign of trouble, but his mind kept drifting to the girl. She was everything now, the one thing he cared about. He had never imagined his life would come to this, to protecting a child, to carrying the weight of her future on his shoulders. But here he was, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The bike rumbled beneath him as they passed a small gas station. He didn't stop, but his eyes scanned the place quickly. It was just like every other small town stop. Nothing remarkable, but something about it caught his eye. A car parked at the pumps, an older model, worn but clean. He didn't recognize it, but it was enough to make him wary. They didn't need to be noticed. Not yet. Not until he had a better sense of what they were up against. Jake kept going, the sound of the bike's engine echoing in the empty space around them. The quiet road stretched out ahead, and in that moment, it felt like they were the only two people left in the world. The weight of the promise to her mother was still there, heavy in his chest, but Jake couldn't think about that now. They had to keep moving. Keep moving until they found the answers. Until they found her. The sun had almost set, the sky turning dark, and Jake knew they needed to find a place to stop for the night. The little girl was still quiet, her eyes focused on the road ahead. Jake glanced over at her. She looked tired, but she didn't complain. She was trying to be strong, just like he had taught her. But the truth was, he didn't know how much longer they could keep going like this. The road was long. Too long. The road stretched on endlessly, the tires humming steadily against the asphalt as Jake and the little girl continued their journey. The sun had almost set, the last hints of orange fading into the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a soft twilight. Jake's mind was focused, but a constant undercurrent of doubt gnawed at him. They had been on the road for days, with no real plan or destination, and while the promise to find her mother kept him moving forward, the road was beginning to feel like an endless loop. The little girl had grown quieter, a small, distant figure on the back of the bike. She no longer asked questions, no longer spoke of her mother. Instead, she clung silently to Jake's back, her small hands gripping the sides of his jacket. He could feel her weight on him, both physically and emotionally. He hadn't spoken much either, but there were moments when he felt a deep connection with her. Moments when he realized that this journey wasn't just about finding her mother, but about finding something in himself he had long since buried. The world around them was silent now, save for the occasional passing car, but Jake didn't trust that silence. Something didn't feel right. He could sense it, the tension in the air, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. He glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the road behind them. Nothing unusual, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them. "We need to find somewhere to rest for the night," Jake muttered to himself, but loud enough for the little girl to hear. She stirred slightly, but didn't respond. He was starting to feel it too, exhaustion. The kind of weariness that goes beyond the body, sinking deep into the soul. Jake took a deep breath and scanned the area ahead. A few miles up, he noticed a small motel, its neon sign flickering weakly in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "Let's stop there," Jake said, pulling the bike toward the motel. The little girl sat up a little straighter as they approached, but her face remained unreadable. She was still lost in her thoughts, a quiet sadness that Jake couldn't seem to break through. As they pulled into the parking lot, Jake's eyes swept the place, taking in the rundown appearance. The parking lot was half empty, the faded signs swinging loosely in the wind. The motel looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. But it was a place to rest, and that's all they needed right now. Jake dismounted the bike and helped the little girl off the back. She looked up at him, her tired eyes filled with a mix of uncertainty and trust. "We'll be safe here for the night," Jake assured her, trying to sound more confident than he felt. She nodded, but didn't say anything. He led her into the small office, where the old clerk behind the counter looked up from a magazine, raising an eyebrow at their appearance. "Room for two?" the man asked, his voice thick with the boredom of too many years spent in the same place. Jake nodded, handing over a few bills. "Yeah, just for the night," he said, trying to keep it casual. The clerk took the money without another word and handed Jake the key. "Room 6, he muttered, then went back to his magazine. Jake didn't care. They were tired, and all he needed was a safe place to rest their heads for the night. He turned and motioned for the little girl to follow him, leading her toward the room. As they walked down the dimly lit hallway, Jake could hear the soft shuffle of her footsteps behind him. He didn't look back. He knew she was still afraid, still unsure of what would happen next. He could feel it, the tension in the air, the unspoken words between them. But for now, they needed rest. Room 6 was small, just a single bed with worn sheets and a small desk by the window. The air smelled faintly of old cigarettes, but it was quiet, and for the first time in days, Jake felt the weight of exhaustion start to settle in. He locked the door behind them and set down their things. The little girl walked over to the bed, sitting down with a sigh. She looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "Jake, do you think we'll find my mom?" Her voice was soft, a hint of hope lingering in the words, but Jake knew better than to promise something he wasn't sure he could deliver. He sat down beside her, his heart heavy with the weight of her question. "I don't know," Jake said honestly, his voice low. "But I promise you, we won't stop looking. We'll find her, no matter what." The little girl looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his eyes, something to believe in. Finally, she nodded, her face softening. "Okay," she whispered. Jake could see the trust in her eyes, the belief that maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this together. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he made a promise to himself, not just to find her mother, but to protect her, to make sure she was safe, no matter what it took. The night passed quietly, the sounds of the storm outside fading into the distance. Jake stayed awake, listening to the girl's quiet breathing as she slept. He couldn't rest. Not yet. He still had a job to do, and the road ahead was still uncertain. The morning came far too quickly, the light creeping through the thin curtains of the small motel room, casting long shadows across the floor. Jake had barely slept, his mind racing through the night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the girl's face, her trusting eyes, her silent questions that he had no answers for. His promise to her echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the responsibility now weighing on his shoulders. He had promised he would find her mother, but as the hours passed, that promise seemed harder and harder to keep. He had no idea where to start looking. The map was useless, the leads non-existent. They were as lost as they had ever been. Jake sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. The room was quiet, save for the soft breathing of the little girl still asleep on the bed. She looked so small, so vulnerable, tucked beneath the thin blankets. For a brief moment, Jake felt a pang of guilt. He had dragged her into this. She hadn't asked for any of it. She had just been a little girl trying to find her way home, and now, she was stuck with him. He stood up, his legs stiff from the long ride, and walked over to the window. He glanced out, seeing nothing but a few scattered buildings and a stretch of highway disappearing into the distance. It was a small town, and it felt like the kind of place where people disappeared without a trace. Jake didn't like that feeling. He didn't trust small towns. They always had secrets, and in places like this, Secrets were dangerous. He turned back to the girl, watching her for a moment. She was still asleep, her face soft with innocence, untouched by the harsh realities of the world around her. She had been through so much already, and Jake hated that he couldn't give her any answers. All he could do was keep her safe, and that was becoming harder with every mile they traveled. After a few minutes, Jake shook himself from his thoughts and walked to the small bathroom to freshen up. He splashed some cold water on his face, trying to clear the fog in his head. The sound of the water dripping from the faucet was the only noise in the room, but even that felt too loud, too invasive in the stillness. When he stepped back out, the little girl was awake, sitting up in the bed, looking around. She didn't say anything at first, just watched him, her eyes still filled with uncertainty. "Morning," Jake said softly, trying to sound reassuring, though his voice lacked the certainty he wanted to convey. The girl nodded, but didn't smile. She seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked, moving closer to her. She shrugged, her shoulders hunched slightly as if trying to protect herself from something invisible. "I'm okay," she said quietly. Her voice was small, but there was a quiet strength in it that Jake hadn't noticed before. He studied her for a moment, seeing the weariness in her eyes. "We'll find her," he said, his voice steady. "I promise." The girl didn't answer, but she looked at him with a hint of hope in her gaze, the faintest spark of belief. Jake felt the weight of that look, and for a moment, it nearly broke him. He had to find her mother. He had to. He couldn't fail her, not now. "Let's get packed up," Jake said, forcing himself to focus. "We've got a long day ahead." They gathered their things in silence, and as they walked out of the room, Jake couldn't help but feel the eyes of the world on them. The little girl walked beside him, her small hand still gripping his sleeve. Jake could feel the weight of that trust, and it both steadied him and pushed him forward. They were leaving the motel behind, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead felt heavier than any of the miles they had already traveled. They climbed onto the bike, the sound of the engine filling the air as Jake revved it up and pulled out of the parking lot. The little girl sat quietly behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, holding on. The road stretched out ahead, long and winding, the pavement glistening from the remnants of the morning rain. Jake kept his eyes on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to the promise he had made. Every mile felt like a step closer to something he wasn't sure he could find. But he had no choice. He couldn't stop now. Not for her. Not for himself. The road ahead would be difficult. The world was full of dangers he couldn't control, but he would face them. He would face whatever came their way. Because no matter what, he couldn't fail her. He couldn't leave her alone in this world. The miles passed slowly, the road winding through the countryside as Jake kept his eyes on the horizon. The little girl sat quietly behind him, her hands gripping his jacket, her face pressed against his back as if she were trying to find some comfort in the motion of the bike. Jake didn't say much. There was nothing left to say. His mind was racing with the same questions that had plagued him for days. Where was her mother? How would they find her? What were they up against? But those were questions without answers. They couldn't stop now. He had promised her, and he would keep that promise, no matter what. They had left the small motel behind, the dusty roads leading them further into unknown territory. The world outside was vast, and the silence that hung between them was thick with the weight of everything they had been through. There were no signs, no indications of where they were headed, but Jake couldn't stop thinking that they were getting closer. The storm had passed, but the feeling of uncertainty still hung over him. He had always relied on his instincts, but this time, those instincts were telling him nothing. It was like he was stumbling through fog, unable to see the path ahead. The little girl shifted slightly behind him, her small voice cutting through the silence. "Jake?" she asked, her voice hesitant, unsure. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest of moments. "Yeah. Do you think we'll find her?" she asked, her words barely audible over the roar of the engine. Jake's heart tightened at the question, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't afford to show weakness. "We will," he said, his voice steady, though doubt crept into his chest. "I promise." She didn't say anything else, but Jake could feel the weight of her trust pressing against him. She believed him, but she was scared. They both were. As the day wore on, the sun sank lower in the sky, casting a golden hue across the fields they passed. The wind had died down, and the air felt heavy, like something was about to change. They passed a few small towns, but Jake didn't stop. The longer they stayed on the road, the more exposed they were. He needed to keep moving, to keep her safe. But the roads were becoming less familiar, the towns more isolated. The world outside was beginning to feel more like a maze, each turn taking them further away from any sense of certainty. They had been traveling for hours when Jake finally spotted a sign for a town up ahead. He slowed the bike, eyeing the sign with caution. The town was small, nestled at the edge of a dense forest, its buildings old and weathered, the streets quiet. It wasn't much, but it was a place to stop, a place to rest, maybe even get some information. Jake pulled into the town, his eyes scanning the area as he parked in front of a small diner. He didn't like how quiet it was. There was something unsettling about the stillness. "Stay close," he told the little girl as they dismounted. She nodded, her small hand finding his as they walked toward the diner. Inside, the place was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of greasy food and old coffee. A few locals sat at the counter, their voices low, as if they were speaking in hushed tones. The waitress behind the counter looked up as they entered, her eyes quickly scanning Jake's leather jacket and the little girl at his side. She didn't ask questions, just gave them a curt nod. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice tired, bored. Jake glanced at the menu, but it was more out of habit than anything else. "Just 2 coffees and something simple to eat," he said, trying to keep his tone casual. The waitress nodded again, turning to prepare their order. Jake took a seat at one of the booths, the little girl sliding in beside him. She was quiet again, her eyes wandering around the diner, taking in the faces of the locals. Jake sat back, his mind working overtime. He had to stay alert. The diner felt too quiet, too still. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find answers. The waitress returned with their coffee and a small plate of eggs and toast. She set it in front of the little girl, her gaze lingering for just a second too long. "Where you folks headed?" she asked, her voice casual, but there was an edge to it. Jake glanced at her, his hand resting on his cup. "Just passing through," he said, keeping his answer vague. She didn't press further, just nodded and walked away. Jake turned to the little girl, watching as she picked at her food, not really eating, just pushing the eggs around with her fork. He could see the exhaustion in her, the weight of everything they had been through settling on her small shoulders. But she didn't complain. She was stronger than she let on. He reached across the table, placing his hand on hers. "We'll find her, okay?" he said, his voice low but firm. She looked up at him, her big eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake squeezed her hand, feeling a surge of determination. They had to keep going. They had to find her mother. They couldn't stop now. Not until they did. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden hue over the small town as Jake and the little girl walked down the main street. The last few days had been a blur of uncertainty and endless miles, but now, there was something different in the air. Jake had sensed it the moment they had arrived in this small town, a sense of change, a shift in the world around them. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before, but now, it was undeniable. They had arrived at their destination, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, the weight of the journey seemed lighter. The little girl had finally started to relax, walking beside him with her hand in his. She no longer had the same look of fear in her eyes, though there was still a trace of uncertainty. Jake had promised her mother he would keep her safe, and now, he felt like he might finally be keeping that promise. They reached the edge of town, where a small, worn building stood at the corner of the road. It looked ordinary, unremarkable even, but something in Jake's gut told him this was where they needed to be. He hesitated for a moment, looking at the girl beside him. Her eyes were wide, filled with a cautious curiosity, but she didn't speak. Jake could see the questions in her mind, the same ones that had been haunting him. What was next? Where would they go from here? He wasn't sure, but for the first time in days, he had a feeling that the answers might be closer than he thought. He took a deep breath and gently nudged the door open. The inside was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of old wood and leather. The room was small, with a few mismatched chairs scattered around and a counter at the far end. Behind it, a man was hunched over, sorting through papers, but he looked up as they entered. His eyes quickly assessed Jake and the girl, but there was no judgment in his gaze, just a quiet recognition. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. Jake stepped forward, keeping the little girl close to him. "We're looking for someone," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. The man didn't say anything for a moment, but he studied them both closely. "You came to the right place," he said finally, his tone shifting slightly. He motioned for them to come closer. "Sit down. I know who you're looking for." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He glanced down at the little girl, whose face was filled with a mix of confusion and hope. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Jake sat down, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The man behind the counter moved slowly, deliberately, as if choosing his words carefully. "Your mother. She's been through a lot," he said, his voice quieter now. "But she's not far from here. I can take you to her." Jake felt the world shift beneath him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a surge of hope. It wasn't over. They weren't lost anymore. The girl beside him blinked up at the man, her voice trembling. Is she okay?" The man nodded, though his face remained serious. "She's alive, and that's what matters. But it's not going to be easy." Jake's grip tightened on the little girl's hand, his heart racing. They had finally found a lead, a glimpse of what they had been searching for. But even as hope surged in his chest, he knew the road ahead would be difficult. Nothing ever came easy. The man stood up and moved toward the door. "Come on. I'll take you to her," he said, his voice now filled with quiet resolve. Jake stood up, his legs slightly unsteady from the weight of what was happening. He glanced down at the little girl, who was looking at him with wide eyes, filled with a mix of fear and hope. He nodded, offering her a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We're going to get her back. I promise." They walked out into the fading daylight, the town quiet around them. The man led the way, his steps measured, as Jake and the girl followed closely behind. As they walked down the street, Jake's mind raced. What would they find when they reached her? What had she been through? Was she okay? He didn't know, but the promise he had made to the little girl's mother had been hanging over him for so long. Now, they were on the verge of something. Maybe they wouldn't find all the answers they were looking for, but at least they were closer. For the first time in days, Jake felt a sense of calm settle over him. They were going to find her. They were going to bring her home. I've got a thrilling story for you that dives deep into the world of Hell Angels, exploring their unbreakable bonds, the dangerous roads they travel, and the unexpected moments of humanity that surface amidst all the chaos. In these Hell Angels stories, we meet a biker whose path crosses with a young girl, in desperate need of help. As their journey unfolds, the biker makes a promise to the girl's mother to keep her safe and find her. Along the way, they face uncertainties, treacherous roads, and challenges that test their endurance. Through these Hell Angels stories, you will witness the raw emotions of a biker whose hardened heart begins to soften as he forms a connection with the girl. As they journey through dangerous territories and mysterious towns, the promise made to the girl's mother pushes the biker to go further, with no clear path ahead. Will the biker fulfill his promise and reunite the girl with her mother? These Hell Angels stories unfold in ways you'll never expect, where loyalty, fear, hope, and redemption collide. Join us on this unforgettable ride through one of the most intriguing Hell Angels stories you'll ever hear.